Okay. A very good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the ICRIER-KAS webinar on WTO amidst the changing geopolitical landscape. This is the third session in a four-part series on reforming WTO for the 21st century. The prior sessions were on fairly technical subjects, formulating new approaches to strengthening multilateral trading systems and the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. Today, we thought that as Indians, we love politics more than economics, so we wanted the third session to bring in a little bit of political element, especially the geopolitical element, into the discussion. In today India, there's a growing curiosity and even extensive public discourse regarding the new world order and India's role in it. And perhaps this statement is best captured in the Prime Minister's recent speech in the Parliament 4 days ago. And I'll just quote a few lines from his speech where he said, and I quote, "I can clearly see that in the post-corona period, the world is moving very fast towards a new world order, towards new systems. This is such a turning point that we as Indians should not miss this opportunity. India's voice should remain loud on the main table. India should not underestimate itself for the leadership role. By taking that inspirational opportunity, we will reach that place with full strength, with full force, with full dedication, by taking the country to that place with full resolve. This is the time of resolutions." Very ambitious statement there, but I felt that this particular part of the speech provides a nice backdrop to the discussion we'll be having today. There are three parts to the topic that we have chosen for today's webinar. How the geopolitical landscape is changing, first. Second, what should be the WTO's role in this new landscape? And third, what role should India be playing to ensure that its interest in the new world order is protected and enhanced, especially with regard to trade and investment? With a mission to link India with the world, ICRIER has been a long and strong advocate of free, fair, and rule-based international trade, and in strengthening the global architecture that governs cross-border trade and investment. I'm therefore delighted that our Trade, Investment and Economic Relations team, TIER, has put together a diverse panel of distinguished experts to deliberate on this extremely topical theme of how WTO is and should be responding to the changing geopolitical environment around it. Today's event will be moderated by Dr. Sanjaya Baru, Director, Geo-Economics and Strategy Program at IISS in London. Dr. Baru is an old friend of ICRIER, having served as one of its professors. He also worked as a media advisor to the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and was a member of India's National Security Advisory Board and Secretary General of FICCI. I cannot think of anyone better than Dr. Baru to moderate today's session. So thank you, Dr. Baru, for accepting our invitation. Finally, our sincere thanks to KAS for supporting the series. I'd like to invite Mr. Peter Rimmele, KAS Resident Representative of India, to give his welcoming or introductory remarks. Peter has had a distinguished career as a jurist, judge, lecturer, and as a civil servant. On behalf of the German Foreign Ministry, he served in East Timor, Indonesia, Lebanon, and now in India. Peter is a consummate political thinker, and it has been an absolute pleasure to partner with him and with KAS for this series. So over to you, Peter, for your introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. Your Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a great privilege to get this opportunity to deliver the welcome address at the now already third of 4 webinar series on reforming WTO for the 21st century, initiated by our valued partner ICRIER and the India office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. Considering the in-depth expertise and first-hand knowledge of today's panelists, of luminaries in their respective fields of work, I think we're in for a treat of visionary ideas which will shed light on the pathway ahead, whose time WTO more relevant and ahead of its time for WTO is that idea whose time will never be past if reformed, to keep up with changing global framework conditions. Madam Nirmala Sitharaman, the Honorable Union Minister of Finance, who presented a visionary budget last week, has aptly said that WTO is the only multilateral system in which developed and developing countries sit together at par. And that is a very important aspect for changing the geopolitical landscape and what kind of influence you have there. Ladies and gentlemen, in the past webinars we had, in line with the WTO webinar series, it has become crystal clear that the WTO, despite its many current issues, is well worth being saved. Not only for the benefit of a few individual countries, but for the good of the international community as a whole. Indeed, several paramount reform proposals were advanced by the experts, whose implementation would have the inherent potential to improve or even overcome the many complex stumbling blocks, for instance, current pending issues within the WTO dispute settlement system. However, for most of the current issues within the WTO, it is only fair to question whether these difficulties are caused by the WTO alone, or rather by its member nations and their interests. I believe that it is within this question that we can pinpoint the very essence of the WTO's present-day difficulties. For the WTO's proper functioning will ultimately be driven by the commitment and ambition of its member states, and not vice versa. If such commitment is not given, proposals and amendments within the framework of the WTO are neither feasible nor effective, and the WTO as an instrument or even as an entity is doomed to fail. It is therefore up to the member countries themselves to decide to what extent they will abide by the agreements they have signed, and how the international community will react in case of non-compliance by individual member countries. However, we are unfortunately living in times when global geopolitical tensions are running high, just think of Ukraine, and are severely affecting the world economy. These divisions and conflicts are fueled by the confluence of a variety of factors, including terrorism, cyber threats, the dysfunctional relations between the world's two, shall we say, three major powers, to name a few. All these factors make it increasingly difficult to find consensus and thus solutions to the various crises that are emerging around the world, and also within the intergovernmental organizations such as the WTO. With such political, ideological, and economic divisions pervading the political establishment in many countries around the world, the dire need to unity and to a unity of action within the WTO is unfortunately likely to remain a chimera. This also raises the deeply saddening question as to the existence of real political will in several of the current member states to actually render the WTO functional. Being a European, the question itself weighs heavy on one's mind, given that the final establishment of a regulatory body of international trade has origins in consequences of disastrous wars and the lessons learned therefrom, as well as decades of persuasion. For such a rules-based, multilateral trading system to be in jeopardy is to automatically put global peace in peril with it. After all, trade promotes peace and wealth, of course, and peace promotes trade. And the exemplary ties between my home country and France stand for the veracity of this simple equation. You know that France and Germany were for decades, for ages, they were arch enemies, but look at it now. Very often they try to find and trigger solutions worldwide together. A world without the WTO would inevitably lead to a world where the chances of a peaceful settlement of economic disputes as we are fortunately accustomed to today, are far slimmer. With this in the back of our minds, we cannot avoid taking a hard look into the mirror and ask ourselves, where have we gone astray? It is easy to point to disruptive, undemocratic forces like China and Russia as the sole culprits for the problems within today's WTO, but we should not forget that the pioneers of free trade and our allies, the USA, themselves have blocked any potential solution to the dispute settlement crisis in the WTO as little as 2 years ago. So restoring a direly needed multilateral cooperation is in common interest of all nations, and it requires a change in the current trajectory of the WTO, where trade rules have been written in mega regions, negotiated in an environment that reflect great power asymmetries. Continuing this way will not serve in bringing forward solutions, as the result would be to exclude new trading powers such as India, where it has been requested before already that India should speak louder. Now, we should not keep back India from such key developments. Ultimately, such crucial partner countries would be pushed to formulate their own regional responses or simply live with the rules laid out by others. One thing is certain, either way, support for multilateral cooperation will be severely undermined. Let me conclude, because ultimately, perhaps what we need is not so much what we have observed over the past years, that is small-scale cosmetic amendments within the WTO, but rather a process of collective rethinking of what the WTO stands for, namely the promise of peace and economic prosperity promoted through trade and cooperation. What nobler cause can there be than to strive in unison for such a common goal? And now, without further ado, I'll pass the baton into the capable hands of Dr. Barrow, who will be the moderator of this distinguished panel. Please.
Thank you. Do I start, Nisha? Are you going to say anything? Yeah. Okay, I start. Well, Dr. Mishra, Mr. Rimmele, fellow participants, Claudia, Schmucker, Biswajit, Dhar, Marianne, Schneider-Petsinger, Amitendu Palit, and all those who have logged in. I see 48 people logged in for this session. Welcome to this discussion. Let me first begin by thanking ICRIER for inviting me to chair this session. Incidentally, I'm no longer with the IISS. My designation as Director for Geo-Economics at IISS is now 7 years old. I left 6 years old. I left in 2016. But in 2015, I organized a conference at the IISS very much on this issue of the geopolitics of multilateralism that was published as an Adelphi paper of the IISS, Power Shifts and New Blocks in the Global Trading System. And the former WTO Director General from France, I can't get his name offhand, the Frenchman who was head of the WTO, opened the conference.
Pascal Lamy.
Pascal, correct. Pascal Lamy. I'm growing old.
How can you forget Pascal Lamy?
Yeah. Sorry, as I told you, I'm growing old. Pascal Lamy opened the conference. In fact, worrying about the changing balance of power between the United States and China and developing countries, and what it would do to the multilateral trading system. So the problem of a geopolitical realignment globally and its impact on international trade or multilateral trade is not a new issue. And I'm delighted that ICRIER has decided to have this session today. I must also say to the new director at ICRIER, and Nisha would remember this, 23 years ago, I used to be at ICRIER in 1999. And as a faculty member at ICRIER, I had proposed to do a paper on the potential for an India-ASEAN free trade agreement, and a research committee consisting of the director, then the late Ishar Ahluwalia, the trade professor T.N. Srinivasan, and the IMF deputy managing director Anne Kruger, shot down my idea, saying that ICRIER doesn't believe in regional trade, regionalism in trade, and all these preferential agreements. We believe in multilateral trade. We believe in free trade. And why do you want to waste your time suggesting all these regional agreements? Fortunately, to my rescue, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee then decided to support the idea of an India-South Asia, SAARC free trade agreement, SAFTA as it was called. And also he signed a bilateral free trade agreement with Sri Lanka. So the government of the day had started looking at plurilateral, bilateral, regional free trade agreements. And so finally the research committee at ICRIER allowed me to write that paper. And the paper is still there. I recently checked on your website, goes back all the way to 1999. And India-ASEAN relations have progressed hugely since then. So therefore, I'm glad that ICRIER is looking at the geopolitics of trade, because whether it's the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, or WTO, they are creations of governments. These are intergovernmental agreements. And any intergovernmental agreement, whether it's a trade agreement or a nuclear non-proliferation treaty or arms reduction treaty, or any intergovernmental agreement, reflects the geopolitics of the day. And even the fantasy that economists have had, that we all believe in free trade, has now been given up by the centers of free trade intellectualism in the United States, when President Trump began to talk about fair trade. And the whole crisis of WTO is essentially due to the shift within the trade, the intellectual community of trade theorists and trade policymakers from a concept of free trade to fair trade. That is the crux of the crisis of multilateralism. That is at the crux of negotiating all these plurilateral, bilateral agreements. Are we pursuing free trade, or are we seeking fair trade? And the moment the focus shifts from free to fair, politics comes in. With those opening remarks, we have a distinguished panel. The first speaker on our panel today is from the German Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Claudia Schmucker, who's head of the Geo-Economics division. And I'm glad that you have a Geo-Economics division. As someone who started the first Geo-Economics program at the IISS, and now I see there are lots of such Geo-Economics programs around the world. Claudia has worked on multilateralism, on WTO, on the Doha round, and is an expert in the area. So let me first welcome her. The ground rules are that each of our 4 panelists will initially speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, 7 out. I'm a strict chairperson, so I will in fact stop you from continuing after 7, but you have a range of 5 to 7 minutes in which we look at larger issues. Each one has chosen their set of issues. Then we come to a second round for each one of them, which will be about 3 minutes each, in which they speak specifically on 1 or 2 policy issues. And finally, we end with each of our speakers coming forward with some recommendations for the revival of the multilateral process under the WTO. So let me first invite Dr. Schmucker. I hope I pronounced your second name correct.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you also to ICRIER for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to speak about these really important issues that Dr. Baru and also Mr. Rimmele already mentioned. And I think I can build up on what was said before, because when I listened to Mr. Rimmele, he said the future of the WTO will be driven by the commitment of its member states. And this is exactly the problem that we have right now, because the commitment to pursue these multilateral approaches is waning. And this is the reason why global economic governance is increasingly weakened at the moment. This was mentioned before. We are living in a geo-economic environment where large global players, such as the United States and China, are increasingly using their economies as lever to shape international relations as well as regional and global regulatory structures. As was mentioned before, the US, that started under the Trump administration, pursued an America First approach to push for American strategic interests in a variety of policy areas, most notably trade, investment, technology, and energy. China, on the other hand, has been using geo-economic approaches for some time. With the Belt and Road Initiative, it is attempting to open markets, to create economic dependencies, and to enforce Chinese norms and standards. There's an ongoing rivalry between these two superpowers, between China and the United States, and this has negative consequences for third countries, for countries like India, also the EU, but particularly also negative consequences for the work of international organizations like the WTO. Because if the two large superpowers rely on their economic strength to pursue their interests, multilateral organizations that establish global rules and that protect weaker countries, it was mentioned that they are sitting at the same table with the same rights and obligations, they are losing their relevance because we are moving to a power-based trade relationship. And this is why our former Chancellor Angela Merkel stressed that the erosion of international institutions is one of the biggest threats to the world. Because multilateral institutions are increasingly questioned more than ever before. As a result, they are weakened without having better or newer organization. And this holds true for the WTO, which is facing a highly uncertain future. Dr. Baru and Ms. Rimmele also mentioned that all pillars of the organization are damaged. We have the dispute settlement system that is no longer working since December 2019 because the US refuses to appoint new members to the appellate body. This policy was initiated during the Trump administration, but there has been no progress so far under the Biden administration. And the reason for that is because the US feels that the WTO cannot contain a rising China, and as such, they have lost the interest and a lot of focus on the organization. We have the trade liberalization area, the Doha round, which has been basically deadlocked, in my view, since 2008. So there's no progress on new rules that are needed or on any kind of trade liberalization. The rules are outdated and do not reflect the realities of modern trade, which lead a lot of countries to go back from multilateralism to regional and bilateral free trade agreements. The third pillar, just to mention it really briefly, the monitoring function, which aims to establish predictability and transparency in trade, is also not working because the notification function is not working. So this means that the WTO remains a permanent construction site at the moment. So what about the EU? Since the 1950s, I mean, the EU is a supranational body in itself. And for a long time, the EU has trusted multilateral institutions like the WTO for the resolution of tensions. Why is that so? The EU and also Germany are very closely interlinked in global trade and global supply chains. We have a very high trade to GDP ratio, and we are very interlinked. And this means that it's in the strategic interest of countries like Germany, but also for the EU as a whole, to ensure the effectiveness of the WTO, which guarantees a rules-based system. And this is needed if you want to promote global trade. Therefore, in its new trade strategy that the EU initiated in February 2021, the EU has a whole section on multilateralism. The EU has new trade strategies maybe every 5 years, and the previous one focused a lot on regional and bilateral trade agreements. This new trade strategy has a shift back to multilateralism. So there is a whole annex on WTO reform, and the EU states that a stable trading environment with the WTO at its center is a top priority for European trade. And the EU really wants to play a major role in the reform discussion. And the whole annex is just about how to reform the WTO. And this relates to all three pillars that I mentioned, to the dispute settlement system, to the negotiation function, as well as to the monitoring function. I'm happy to say more about later in the discussion, but the EU really goes into detail on how to reform. They really listen to the concerns by other countries such as the United States and other member states and really try to address these issues to push for WTO reform. What is true is that the EU in parallel has a large variety of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. They are very comprehensive. The EU has a large net of these agreements, and they have been reached with industrialized countries such as Canada or Japan, with emerging market economies like Singapore, and if you count Mercosur, also Brazil, but also with developing countries such as Vietnam. The EU sees these agreements as complementary or even supportive of the WTO. They contain WTO plus provisions which are not part of WTO rules yet. So they relate to competition, to investment, to labor and environmental standards, digital trade, IPR, anti-corruption, a lot of issues that have not been treated at the WTO because we're stuck in the negotiating pillar. And the EU wants to see these rules that they negotiate on the bilateral and regional level as stepping stones and would like to see them multilateralized at a later stage at the WTO. So the EU has this parallel strategy of negotiating bilateral and regional free trade agreements and of wanting to reform the WTO at the same time. But I would say with the new trade strategy that the EU just published, the focus is definitely on WTO reform. Thank you. You're muted.
Sanjaya. Sorry, I'm muted. I said thank you also for sticking to time. When you mentioned that the EU has a strategic interest in the WTO, it reminded me of many statements by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh when he was the Prime Minister, emphasizing how India has a strategic interest in multilateralism. And the reason why India has a strategic interest in multilateralism is in fact in some ways exact opposite of EU's, which is that we are such a small player in the global trading economy, our share of world trade being still around 2% or less compared to EU, which is a major trading nation. But because of your, because trade is so important for you, you have a strategic interest, but because trade is so insignificant for us, we have a strategic interest in a multilateral regime because this, as a small player, we want fair rules and a fair system. But for very different reasons, I think the word strategic comes into play both in the EU's perception and India's. I will now invite Dr. Professor Biswajit Dhar, who's one of India's distinguished trade policy specialists, has been actively engaged in making trade policy as an advisor to the government. He was head of the Research and Information System and now is a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Biswajit Dhar.
Thank you, Sanjay. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Deepak Mishra, the KS, Mr. Peter Rimmele, Nisha, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. And I think we need such discussions more often to get a fair idea as to where we should move on this particular issue. And also a warm welcome to my fellow panelists. And I've really heard with a lot of interest what Claudia had to say about her perspective on the WTO. I agree with her, quite significantly in the sense that the WTO is really in a real crisis today. And I would say that this is a kind of a legitimacy crisis that the WTO hasn't seen before. And cutting across all the three arms of the WTO, the negotiating rulemaking arm, and the dispute settlement arm, which has been sort of the questions have been asked about its legitimacy for a long time, and of course, the whole aspect of transparency I've been talking and writing about these issues. Now, this is really a very unfortunate kind of a situation, because at a time when we need the WTO most, and my mind goes back to the formation of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and we are almost at a similar juncture. We are actually in a phase where the global economy needs to rebuild, and rebuild in a manner that has benefits for all constituencies. And what better opportunity for doing that than a multilateral system? So when the founders of the GATT thought of this, they took this whole leap of faith and formed the multilateral trading system. They had a very interesting, sort of preambular paragraph, and I want to repeat that, and I repeat that most of the time when I talk about WTO. And this links up with what Peter said about, you asked this question, what does this WTO stand for? And I think that's the question that very few people actually ask, because there's been such a great anxiety to just talk about trade liberalization without really looking at what was the perspective of the founders of the GATT and then the WTO. And it's actually the identical. So if you look at the preambular paragraph of the GATT and that of the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO, it talks about the economic well-being, raising standards of living, employment. So we're actually talking about the larger development issues, which was expected to be served by trade liberalization. So trade liberalization wasn't supposed to be an end in itself. It wasn't supposed to be just sort of cutthroat competition to grab markets. It was, of course, supposed to keep markets open, but also ensure that the global community actually benefits. And of course, there was always the emphasis on pulling the smaller countries, the developing and the least developed countries up with their bootstraps. So this was really the objective of the GATT then and the WTO now, which has actually sort of just disappeared. And it has disappeared. Again, we were hearing from both Peter and Claudia about the tendencies shown by the big economic powers to really grab the organization and get it to work according to their own sort of needs and their sort of strategic interests, quote unquote. And this is not happening just now. I'm just in the midst of writing a paper on the legitimacy of the WTO. The way the WTO was formed from GATT and the way the United States used its own unilateral powers to shape the Uruguay round negotiations is part of something that we all know. And what resulted from that was that, when we thought that the whole, the North-South issues are going to be sort of behind us, and we have now in a globalized world where the North-South divisions will slowly disappear, the North-South divide in trade actually got firmly entrenched. And this was a legacy of the Uruguay round agreements. So if you look at this whole history of how the Uruguay round agreements were not supported by most developing countries, soon after the WTO was formed, they came up with a document talking about implementation issues. And they had actually a list of 100 items where they said that, most of the major agreements were not really serving the interest of the developing countries. So again, with reference to the chapeau of the preambular paragraph, the aspirations of the countries who had joined the WTO with the hope that, trade is going to be assisting in their development, that wasn't actually happening. So we started with this whole thing. And then, of course, there was a brief attempt, to address this issue. The Dhar round came in, and we call it the Dhar development agenda, where we thought that, the imbalances of the agreements, major agreements in agriculture, intellectual property, etc. All these agreements, the imbalances will be sort of rectified. And again, with what Peter was saying, that we made this attempt not just to sort of cut the i's, dot the i's and cutting the t's. The agenda was something to do much more than this, and to rebalance those agreements. Now that didn't happen. In fact, what actually happened was, if you look at from the point of view of India, some of these agreements became more and more onerous. For instance, today we are sitting in agriculture with a very big problem, which is being posed by the WTO, as to whether or not we'll be able to maintain our public food distribution system. And this has been questioned in the WTO, because the way the WTO has been, the Agriculture and Agriculture looks at the grant of food aid to the poor is not legal, quote unquote, within the WTO framework. So while it's legal as far as the United States is concerned, and the instruments that the United States uses to provide food to the poor, namely food stamps, when governments provide food to the poor through this public distribution system, that's supposed to be illegal. Now, I think this is a fundamental issue, and I think it really breaks the back of the organization if the organization comes and tells a sovereign state, well, hey, we'll tell you how to provide food to the poor. I'll just take one more minute. And finally, we are now sitting here with a major problem in the midst of the COVID pandemic, where again a large number of developing countries went to the WTO seeking waiver from the application of intellectual property laws, so that medicines and vaccines can be provided to the poor, needy countries more. From 2020 October, we are still sitting here, not expecting any solution anytime in future. So I think these are some of these issues which are really dogging the organization, and I dare say that the North-South divide could actually become even more deeper. I'm sorry, Sanjay, I took longer than I should have.
That's okay. That's okay. I was just reminding you that's all. Thanks. I mean, you also just took about 7 minutes. But, I'm delighted that you focused on the North-South issue, because the so-called geopolitics of the day that we have been reading about in the media for the last several days and weeks is the East-West conflict. And in fact, even today, there was a reference to the East-West conflict, Ukraine and the US versus the Soviet Union and so Russia and China. But I think there is an equally important geopolitical divide that remains and which is not talked about. This whole dialogue of North-South has virtually disappeared. Even from some of our own positions in India, I keep reminding people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that, you guys have forgotten North-South kind of issues. And I'm glad you referred to it, because the Doha round was called the Doha Development Round. And you just look at the literature in the last 5 years, nobody refers to it as the Doha Development Round. I mean, Biswajit, you are one of the few people in the world who still remembers it was the Doha Development Round. But even Indians who write about, Doha Round, forgetting the middle D, which is, it was originally conceived as the Doha Development Round. So in some ways, we have glossed over this North-South divide. And I'm glad you mentioned the vaccines and the IPR issue around vaccines, because in some ways that is very much a North-South issue. Though, again, India is in between on that, given our own vaccine, business that we have developed. But nevertheless, I think these are the important issues, and I'm glad you raised them. Our third speaker this afternoon is from Chatham House, Marianne Schneider-Petsinger. Dr. Petsinger is a project lead for the Chatham House Global Trade Policy Forum. She was a non-resident fellow at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies and has been affiliated to Johns Hopkins University. She has also worked extensively with the German Economic Affairs Ministry in Germany. So welcome this afternoon, Dr. Petsinger, Schneider-Petsinger. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a fascinating discussion, and let me just follow on some of the things that have already been pointed out, but I think honing in on kind of 5 key developments that are shaping the geopolitics of trade, and that's the future of the World Trade Organization. The first one being that the traditional champions of the rules-based international trade order are very much undermining the system. And obviously, Claudia's already mentioned the United States under the Trump administration that really seriously called into question the US's commitment to the multilateral trade system. But just let me add that Trump really was more a symptom rather than a cause, because many of the US's concerns predate the Trump administration and they haven't gone away. And the same with some of the practices. Was actually in 2011 under the Obama administration when the US first blocked the reappointment of an appellate body member. And again, even the Biden administration has embraced many of the aspects of Trump's trade policies, whether that is with regards to the appellate body, where we're still not seeing the unblocking of the appointment process, and also with regards to China, where again, much of the kind of bilateral aspects of the relationship between China and the US are managed outside of the WTO, with the US-China Phase 1 deal still in place and much more emphasis being put on enforcement. But frankly speaking, really the US signaling that rather than working within the WTO system to hold China to account, it's looking at bilateral solutions. So the key question, I think, is how committed is the US to the WTO? How serious is the US about reforming the organization? What does it take for the US to actually walk the talk of exercising leadership? The second big trend, I would say, is rising protectionism. And again, we've seen a backlash against globalization even before the election of President Trump. That's about, US jobs, concerns around wages linked to the China shock, but also very much linked to national security concerns. And again, unilateral tariffs have been on the rise, linked to national security or economic security concerns. And also in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, really the proliferation of export restrictions and a turn towards protectionist trends. So I think there again, the renewed focus on supply chain security raises questions about how can you actually protect critical goods and supply chains without sliding into protectionism. Linked to that is the big theme of how to deal with China. That's my point 3. Lots of concerns on that front, from tackling non-market economy practices linked to state-owned enterprises, to intellectual property theft, subsidies, a whole range of issues. The question here is, how do you engage with China? How do you manage competition on the one hand, cooperation on the other hand, and coordinating at the same time? What does that mean for the WTO? I think the key question here is, in light of the very different economic systems between market economies on the one hand and China's model on the other hand, is the future of the WTO about convergence, or is it really just about coexistence? The next big trend is that, obviously the WTO cannot be reformed without the US and the EU and other key players working together. But at the same time, the US and the EU are working very much in cooperation on some of those shared concerns that I've already outlined, but they also need to manage underlying bilateral tensions. There has been some progress on that front recently with regards to the Boeing Airbus subsidies, for example, or the steel and aluminum tariffs. But again, this is still in the process of being worked out and much more needs to be done. And last but not least, I think the 5th point really is that we're seeing a turn away from multilateralism towards a more regionally focused and plurilateral or sectoral strategy of dealing with trade issues. And to some extent, that isn't because of geopolitics. I would say it's also because the WTO has become a victim of its own success. With 164 members, it's really, really challenging to come to consensus and to move the trade agenda forward. And so in a sense, it's not surprising that we actually have seen the proliferation of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. And again, the regionalization is very much the whole alphabet soup of trade deals. CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and a whole range of other kind of regional agreements that we've seen alongside very much sectoral agreements. And here I think the ongoing negotiations for e-commerce is going to be something that we'll come back to later in the discussions. But for me, the key question here, and I'll finish on that, is what is the relationship between the multilateral, the plurilateral, and the regional arrangements? How do they interact, and how do we ensure that they actually build on each other rather than becoming stumbling blocks? And what is the future? Is it regional and plurilateral initiatives? Probably yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne. This conference I referred to that the IISS organized in 2015, even at that stage, we had taken the view that while the WTO viewed regional agreements and plurilateral agreements as building blocks of multilateralism, which was in the early 1990s, by 2015 itself, the regional agreements were emerging as, in fact, barriers to multilateralism, in a sense, threats to multilateralism. So this transition had already happened, where regional agreements were less and less building blocks and more barriers to multilateralism, and I think that has happened. But I'm glad you focused on the challenge posed by China, because in some ways, many of the problems that the WTO has had to face were because of the manner in which China was accommodated. If you look at the history of China's accommodation into the WTO, it was a geopolitical accommodation. The enormous lobbying that went on within the United States by American business that had already built capacities in China for accessing the international market. They lobbied congressmen in the US. They lobbied Bill Clinton. And I have actually an essay on this I've written recently, looking at the role of Kissinger and Kissinger Associates and all the businessmen who funded Kissinger and Bill Clinton and the American business corporate interest in getting China into WTO. So China got an easy pass into the WTO in 2000. And now the US is facing the consequences of that. So actually, this whole crisis is a consequence of the manner in which the geopolitics of US-China relations has played out in the last 20, 25 years. And I think that's an interesting issue for us to think about. Finally, I would say that, when you talk about proliferation of members, it's true there are 160 members, but at the end of the day, very few matter in the process. I mean, it's not like the UN General Assembly. I mean, nor is it like the Security Council. It's somewhere in between where a few players matter. Our final panelist, fourth panelist, is Dr. Amitendu Palit, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies and is the head of the Trade and Economics group at ICRIER-KAS. Dr. Palit has been with the Ministry of Finance in India. He is actively associated with the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. Dr. Palit has published extensively on trade policy. Amitendu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baru. I'd like to begin by thanking ICRIER and KS for organizing this excellent discussion and for inviting me to present my views on this forum. I'll straight away come to the geopolitical shaping of trade in the part of the world that I live and work in, which is essentially the Asia Pacific. And I would like to focus upon three distinct phases during which this geopolitics is shaped. The first begins after the financial crisis of 2008, which saw the United States turning its focus very extensively to the Asia Pacific, primarily out of a realization that within the multilateral space of the WTO, the collapse of trade talks at Geneva in July 2008 is probably not going to leave much space for United States interests to be pursued out over there. And at the same time, the transatlantic crisis was also responsible for letting the US shift its focus to more vibrant markets in a part of the world which were relatively less affected. Now, once the US turned its focus, into the Asia Pacific, started looking closely at Southeast Asia, it realized that this was a region where the strategic and economic influence of China, primarily the geo-economic influence, was enormous. And that probably led to the realization that no trade conversation in the region can actually proceed without an accurate focus upon the geopolitics, which China has started to wield around itself. And let's not forget that the United States FTA engagements and trade engagement technically always historically has been with its defense partners and allies. Now that led to the development of a very interesting process and initiative. I describe it as a process because that led to the formation of the TPP. The TPP was nowhere. It was just a 4-member small club called the P4 Agreement between Singapore, Chile, Brunei, and New Zealand. But when the United States joined it and decided to take the initiative forward, the TPP not just expanded in economic scope, but the TPP became an increasingly strategic goal for the United States to push ahead in the Asia Pacific. And Dr. Baru would recall that at a point in time, the then Defense Secretary of the United States, Ash Carter, actually referred to the significance of the TPP as much as that of an aircraft carrier. And the turning point came when the United States President Barack Obama himself described the TPP as something that needs to be endorsed by the US legislature, because otherwise the rules of trade in the region would start to be driven by China through the RCEP. Now, this was the first time that the element of this very stiff geopolitical competition that came to color trade and trade agreements became very obvious, because till that time, the RCEP was proceeding parallelly as an ASEAN-centric architecture. But this admission by President Obama led no doubt about the fact that the United States viewed it as a sphere of influence by China, which it was building up around this particular club of 15 nations. And this is more so given the fact that the RCEP and TPP had a large number of common members, and they continue to have so. Well, this was the first phase when President Obama went out of office, with the opposition against TPP for a variety of domestic reasons being very severe in the UP. And as soon as President Trump came in, he withdrew the US from the TPP. But thereafter began a very different narrative of geopolitical exertion, which came out of the fact that by this time, the US and China were clear about the fact that the future would be belonging to that of the two of them who would have a command in technological assets. And this is from where the process of techno-nationalism, connecting technological advances to the geopolitical ability, gathered spectrum. While the US moved out of the TPP, it replaced its strategic prominence towards the region by a very forceful articulation of the idea of Indo-Pacific. And by this time, what had also happened was that the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao regime in China had been replaced by the President Xi, Prime Minister Li Keqiang regime, which also took a very different view of the way China should engage with the rest of the world. So what we find over here is this very interesting situation where the United States cuts out of multilateralism, starts looking at trade relations from a completely bilateral prism, starts bringing in national interest and national security interests very prominently within the space of trade relationship and the trade frameworks. And what we also find is a parallel movement on the RCEP. And the RCEP went on very quietly, except for the issues that India encountered during the RCEP. The rest of the region wasn't really bothered about the RCEP because it seemed so innocuous as compared to the tensions surrounding the US-China trade war, and which really began affecting the region badly, to the extent that at a point in time, the Singapore Prime Minister, Minister Lee Hsien Loong, actually went on record saying that the world should not force countries to take sides the way the US-China relationship was shaping. Now, when all this was actually reaching a peak, so as to say, COVID-19 broke. And COVID-19 actually accentuated the fault lines between the US and China. And this was the last phase of the geopolitical transition, during which the fault lines of geopolitics have become so sharp that it is no longer possible to visualize any kind of trade compact in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific without looking at it through the geopolitical and geoeconomic prism. That is where we stand today. I'll be very happy to come back and visit issues around this as we go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Baru.
Thank you, Amitin. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think this choice which is being forced between China and the US on a lot of us is at the heart of the problem in the global trading system. India was an enthusiastic proponent of the RCEP, but I think concerns about China certainly prevented us from participating there. And that has in many ways impacted our relations, not just with China, but also with the rest of the RCEP region. And as of now, I know that our major concern in India is that we are not involved in any regional group. We are not members of a single regional trade grouping. Anyway, we'll come to some of those issues again. So I think in the second round, we have had a broad setting of the scene, as it were, by all the four speakers. And in the second round, where I invite each one of you to speak for not more than 3 minutes, if you could sharply focus on 1 or 2 or 3, whatever issues which you think are kind of key issues that in your view are kind of holding up WTO or challenging WTO or coming in the way of the functioning of or revitalization of the functioning of WTO. Let me go back in the same order with Claudia Schmucker as the first speaker.
Yes, thank you very much. I was asked to speak more about environmental and labor concerns and the way how the EU sees these topics also for the WTO, and if there is a divide between the EU and developing countries on these issues. As you all know, climate change is one of the top priorities for the European Union, also for Germany. And environmental issues are very high on the agenda. We have the Fit for 55 program at the EU level, and the EU also wants to have very strong sustainability chapter in its bilateral and regional trade agreements. But the EU also sees sustainability and environmental issue as a key area for the WTO. So what we have right now, we mentioned that a couple of times, the WTO has 164 member states, and even though some have a stronger impact than others, there is still a high uncertainty of where the WTO should head. We have no consensus on the direction of where the WTO should go. And therefore, the EU proposed as a unifying topic for the future of the WTO to focus on the most pressing issues that all WTO member states face, and that is economic recovery and development, as well as environmental and social sustainability. According to the EU, addressing these problems would be in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, to which all WTO member states have committed. So what does the EU propose concretely in the area of environmental concerns? I mean, the EU proposes many things, but I want to focus on the environment. So in the first step, the EU really pushes for the conclusion of the multilateral fisheries negotiations. This is one of the few multilateral negotiations that are left. And it would be the first agreement with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals at its core. It also relates to environmental issues and also to labor concerns. In addition, the EU really wants to strengthen the overall WTO's institutional framework of dealing with environmental issues. And this includes the resumption of the plurilateral agreement on environmental goods. Possibly it could be expanded to services as well. And the EU supports negotiations on fossil fuels, on plastics, on circular economy. Usually it is presented that the EU or industrial countries push for environmental standards while developing countries object. And I would disagree with this notion. I think a lot of it has changed from the Singapore issues at that time, because when we look at the WTO, there are ongoing structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. These include industrialized countries like the EU and US, but also emerging market economies such as China and also developing countries. So this shows, in my opinion, that also developing countries are increasingly worried about the impact of the environment and environmental standards. So there's no clear division on industrialized countries and developing countries on the other hand. We need to be careful that environmental protection does not lead to protectionism. So in my view, if I would offer how to address these environmental concerns, I would say we need inclusive plurilateral agreements which do not discriminate against non-members, which are open to new members, and which aim to be very transparent and predictable for all WTO members. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. I think that's a very, very interesting observation from you. Thank you very much. Let me now move on to Biswajit.
Yeah, muted. Thank you, Sanjay. I think I'll start from where Claudia left. I think looking at India's problem is really what she's talking about, the architecture. India's biggest problem is that the WTO, the multilateral framework, is being broken up into plurilateral processes, and that's the biggest problem, because the whole the WTO is supposed to be working through this whole principle of consensus, and both in terms of the agenda setting and in terms of the negotiating dynamics, it was supposed to be done through consensus, and all the the current sort of negotiations that you are witnessing in the WTO, these are all what is being called as the joint statement initiatives, and this is just a bunch of countries getting together, talking about their strategic interests in that area, and packing up, packaging a kind of a deal, and then offering it to others on a take it or leave it basis. Now, I think that's a fundamental problem, and there's a very interesting paper that was tabled by India and South Africa a couple of years back, questioning this whole dynamics, because the very heart of multilateralism is challenged through these processes. And there is no way that you can get the smaller countries into these agreements without them sacrificing something, because it's very clear, and we have seen it repeatedly, and that's what India has been insisting, that it is important for us to be on the negotiating table, because all the the trade-offs that take place on the negotiating table should happen in a transparent and in a manner that we are all involved in this process. Then how do you then distinguish between a multilateral and a kind of a bilateral initiative that are taking place? So I think this multilateralism is not a sum of all these plurilateral initiatives, and I think we need to understand this very well, because again, going back to where the WTO is pitching, and where WTO what is the core sort of aims and objectives of the WTO is really to take the global community along. And unless you take the global community along in the processes of rule making and in the process of negotiations, I don't think the organization becomes a democratic organization anymore. It becomes, it only reflects the will of the few. So I think this is a major change that is required, and maybe I'll talk about later in the last segment, the things that I feel should be done to get WTO on track. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Biswajit. May I now invite Dr. Schneider-Petsinger?
Thanks again. And again, the key issue, I think, is that the WTO has struggled to address some new trade issues. Again, global supply chains and technology have advanced rapidly. They've transformed global commerce, but the rules of the WTO have simply not kept pace with that change. And again, this becomes increasingly difficult in this new era where we're seeing a convergence of trade with economic competitiveness, with national security, and with technology. And that is, I think, very much related also to the rise of industrial subsidies. I talked about China a bit already, but I think it's also very much evident that the US and the EU and others around the world are really considering and implementing subsidies and tax incentives for strengthening domestic production of critical supply chains, and in particular semiconductors. And I do think that those efforts to discourage China's industrial subsidies do look increasingly hypocritical. And so perhaps, to just take a broader picture here, is that the issue isn't so much about the role of the state in the economy per se, that there is certainly legitimate public intervention that's needed for achieving goals, and the WTO should be set up to accommodate those different degrees of public ownership. But I think the key issue is really how do you effectively counter some of those interventions that have negative spillover effects in the economy, that distort competition in favor of domestic firms, that again, limit access to markets and have an impact then on global markets. And I think in that space, there is some work being done by the US, by the EU, and by Japan in a trilateral initiative. But a key question here is, how do you get others on board as well? Perhaps more broadly speaking, also, the key question going forward is, how do you actually make progress on some of those issues that are under the 21st century trade category, such as, again, subsidies and the role of state-owned enterprises, that has become a much more prominent issue recently, alongside digital trade issues, alongside e-commerce, alongside some of those issues around climate and trade that Claudia mentioned. But, and I think the big but is, without losing sight of many of the key issues of 20th century trade that have not been addressed. And I think here the key is agricultural subsidies and the issue of trade and development. And I think, again, how do you balance that is going to be the key challenge going forward.
Thank you. Absolutely, you're right. And I'm sure there would be lots of comments on that. I think you're absolutely right on kind of looking at these 21st century issues and 20th century issues separately. Finally, Amitendu.
Thank you, Dr. Baru. I think there are 3 items, if I could list from out of the entire list of items preoccupying the WTO as well as global trade at this point in time. These are respectively building resilience of supply chains, ensuring global transition to a clean energy environment, and promoting sustainable development. Now, all 3 are prominent for the WTO. All 3 are equally prominent for most other countries of the world, and all 3 are very heavily geopolitically driven. Supply chain resilience has turned down to a question of minimizing sourcing dependency and reorganizing supply chains around the lack of that dependency, which is primarily a geopolitical decision as opposed to an economic efficiency decision. When we look at clean energy and the trade around clean energy, it's involving technologies that are dual use in nature, and countries will not probably hesitate to not just weaponize this particular part, but also weaponize the issue of carbon standards in trade. And finally, when one looks at sustainability, the entire question of countries competing on sustainable projects across the world is something which cannot be escaped. Now, Dr. Dhar referred to this extremely important point of WTO arriving at decisions on the basis of consensus, which is very true. But unfortunately, the problem is on geopolitics, there is no consensus. So as a result of that, one cannot really take away countries from their intention to utilize economic influence for geopolitical power projection. In that case, what is the WTO left to work on? I think that is a fundamental question which WTO needs to consider at this point in time. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhatt.
Thank you, Amitendu, but why don't we continue with you and reverse the round and start with you and end with Claudia for the final round of looking at kind of some key recommendations which you think the WTO should pay attention to.
For me personally, I think when it comes to the WTO process, there has been a lot of talk that is devoted to the fact that the WTO really needs to change its process in a large number of ways. Now, I am a believer in this very simple truth that we all agree that the WTO is bad, but we don't have a suggestion as to what is better. So I think when the WTO is there in the form of the structure, the way it exists, what WTO really needs to sit up and take note of the fact is that the structure that it inherited probably 25, 30 years ago is to a very large extent not relevant today anymore. it has to find out a way of changing with times. And this is not just a question of moving to a majority-minority voting system or anything of that kind, but it's also a question of taking on board some issues which are extremely important for a large number of countries in the world. And if those cannot be accommodated within the WTO, given its current rules, the WTO has to find out a way of breaking that logjam. If plurilaterals are the way forward, then the WTO has to accept plurilaterals and has to find out a way of accepting them within its framework.
Thank you. Process and structure. Yeah, absolutely right. Marianne?
From process and structure, let me focus on substance and sequence, perhaps. So on substance, I would say that there's 3 key issues that need to be tackled to really keep the WTO relevant, to perhaps even revitalize the organization if it can successfully address those 3 issues. And those 3 issues are, first of all, progress on sustainability issues. And here, I think failure to successfully conclude fishery subsidies negotiations would really just not be bad from an environmental perspective, but also undermine quite significantly the credibility of the WTO. Updating the rules for digital trade and innovation is the second point. And the third one, as I've mentioned already, tackling those negative spillovers on state intervention in the economy. Now on sequence, I think a bite-sized approach would be best. I think there's a lot of, again, parallel efforts going on to revitalize the WTO, but they're best probably if they proceed incrementally, starting with some very short-term results to advance and unblock some of those stalemates. But I think the one thing that we haven't really talked about, but that needs to be still addressed, is dispute settlement and updating that. I think here it's a priority, but it's very, very challenging. So I think that dispute settlement reform should not be linked to the other aspects of WTO reform. At the same time, again, I realize it's a thorny issue. And why would WTO members want to update the rules if they cannot enforce them? So they are certainly interlinked, but I think to really make progress, you have to separate them. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Claudia? Sorry, Biswajit?
Thank you, Sanjay. No, I think the WTO has to think hard as to where it wants to take itself. Because if you are talking about what we now call a variable sort of geometry, and you have these kinds of processes, then I think WTO needs to rename itself. It can't be a multilateral trading system. You call it by any other name, but if you want to keep the sanctity of the institution, then you have to ensure in one way or the other that at least as I was kept mentioning this, that you have to ensure that the trade is a means to an end. You just can't have this kind of growing inequities, and you can just be blinded to the fact that it's just going to be to the benefit of just a few. So even in the plurilateral processes, I think it is important for those taking the initiative in these processes to just try and think whether what is there for other countries who are not in the same development bracket as they are. Is there something that they can offer to these countries as an incentive for them to be part of the processes? Now, I think most of the initiatives that I've been sort of studying, or all the initiatives that I've studied, it's just a very kind of narrow, strategic, nationalistic interest of the countries which are which is driving these plurilateral processes. And this is surely going to create more problems rather than find solutions, because then you are going back to a situation of possibly if I'm I have an extremely pessimistic kind of a scenario, then you go back to the days of the 30s when then you are just trying to grab markets by whichever means that you can, and that's not desirable. So I think it's a fair dialogue within the WTO is very important to and the lead has to be taken by the bigger economies, both from the developed and the developing world, to see how this organization can be made more democratic. Because if you, as I said, that if you want to call it a multilateral trading system, and you want to make it respond to the needs of particularly the lesser developed countries, then this change has to take place. I don't think there is any attempt to talk to each other. Most of the things that is happening in the WTO is talking at each other. And I think unless you change the way dialogues take place in the WTO, or even outside the WTO on WTO, I dare say we can say goodbye to multilateralism in trade.
Well, on that very inspiring note, Claudia.
Yes, thank you. I want to focus on 2 points. The first one, what Marianne said, I think the most important thing is to have a functioning and binding dispute settlement system. If we negotiate rules but cannot enforce them, what's the point? And so I think it's very difficult. That's what Marianne stressed as well. But we need this binding dispute settlement system. Otherwise, we go back to the GATT system where disputes are never resolved over years and countries just continue the way they did. My second point is revive the negotiation function. And here I really want to contradict my previous speaker. I think we do have a problem, what I mentioned before, that we have no agreement where the WTO should go, which means other than fisheries, we have no progress in any multilateral negotiation. If that's the end, and we say multilateralism or nothing, all the large players will revert to bilateral agreements with countries that are interesting. So it's no problem for the United States, for China, for the European Union. They will continue this bilateral trade negotiations. So we do need progress on the multilateral side, but we have no consensus what to do. And I think we have this mix of multilateral and plurilateral initiatives that is the closest to multilateralism that we can have at the moment. Otherwise, we just revert to regionalism. So we need the fisheries, and we need multilateral negotiations on agriculture. That's a given. Other than that, we have plurilateral initiatives that are initiated not by industrialized countries, but by many developing countries. If you look at the joint statement initiatives, they are on services domestic regulation, on investment facilitation for development. It's on facilitation. It's not on trade liberalization. And when you talk to people at the WTO, to the deputy directors, they say that developing countries are very active in these joint statement initiatives. And it is a way to help them integrate into trade and not to push the interests of industrialized countries on these developing countries. So these joint statement initiatives are initiated by many developing countries and are in the interests of developing countries. And I think that's a major point, that these plurilateral initiatives need to be development friendly. We need to make sure that developing countries have the capacity to engage in these discussions, which could be a major problem. So I think the way forward is through plurilateral initiatives, but at the same time, keep in mind how to engage developing countries so that they are able to negotiate as well. And this means a lot of capacity building is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And we have still about 15 minutes, about a little over 10 minutes for some question answers. And I think we've covered a very interesting range of issues. There's one interesting question in the box. I think someone from ICRIER, Pratik, I guess he's from ICRIER, who asks us whether the G20 should not be the forum that can sort out some of these problems. And it's an interesting question because the G20 has deliberately kept away from trade. And trade has never been really an important part of the G20 agenda. And I think his question is, the G20 presidency is going to be with 3 developing country leaderships successively. So is this not an opportunity for them to kind of push a trade agenda onto G20? I think it's an interesting question. Maybe some of you have some views on what G20 can do to help the multilateral trading system. Why don't we first go with that question around this group, and Nisha, if there are any other questions, we can take them in the quick time we have, but very brief answers so that we have enough time. Anybody wants to take on that question?
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah. I think whenever you have the opportunity to negotiate and trade, you should do it. We have so many problems that it's always necessary. If countries are around the table, they should talk about trade. We have to know that the only legitimate organization to have answers is the WTO, but why not use the group of G20, which is very informal, which has developing countries, emerging market economies, and developed countries at the table to push for WTO reform. The problem that I see is that the dividing lines that go through WTO membership exactly go through the G20 membership. So I think it should be on the agenda. I think the G20 more often failed than succeeded in tackling trade issues, but I think it should stay and countries should really try to find engagement at the G20. And if there is some common ground, go back to that, to the WTO. And India has strong opinions on trade in the WTO, and if it could use the G20 G20 presidency to enhance some of these issues, I would be very happy about that.
Thank you. Biswajit, there is a set of questions for you in the chat box. Have you seen them, if you want to answer that?
Okay.
Meanwhile,
Yeah.
can
I do that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think India's views on GSIs are very clear. That there are certain like all other countries, India also has a strategic interest. It's trying to achieve its larger interest through trade, and to the extent that these objectives are reflected in these JSIs, India would be part of it. The problem is that at this point in time there is a divergence between how the JSIs are structured and the questions the JSIs are asking, and what India is aspiring for. So if India gets into the JSIs and then India starts raising those issues, then the next thing that the Western press is going to do is raise a red flag and say, here is India into the JSIs, blocking all the progress and not letting us move. So I think that's why I said that at the outset there has to be a minimum, the common minimum kind of an agreement on where you want to take these processes forward. Of course, there is no disagreement in India about the importance of e-commerce, but there are certain issues on which India is sort of asking some questions, and those need to be sort of reflected in the way that the negotiations on e-commerce are going. On trade facilitation, on investment facilitation for development. Let me answer that question. It is not investment facilitation per se, because at various points, and you can check the negotiating documents, several countries who are part of the investment facilitation process have said that this is a stepping stone for a larger process of having a multilateral agreement on investment. Now that's a different ballgame altogether. We may actually have a multilateral agreement on investment, and India was very much involved in that process when trade and investment will be discussed as one of the Singapore issues. India has a number of submissions in that process, stating very clearly how we would like to balance the two sides of the equation, the investors and the host countries. So there's no problem about that. But the moment you say that you're not going to be, what is investment facilitation after all? I can give a whole lecture on that. That's not an issue. But the thing is that my brief point is that there has to be a common minimum, sort of common denominator on which the major economies must converge, and that is the way to take the bilateral processes forward.
Okay, thanks. There's one question, maybe Amitabh, you would like to take this up on special and differential treatment. Should this be given up? I mean, is it one way of resolving problems between developed and developing countries? Is it a good idea for India to surrender on this?
I think, Dr. Baru, President Trump had actually really let the cat loose among the pigeons when he alluded to this, that some countries don't deserve that special and differential treatment. The problem is that today, when I look back and look at the WTO, And when you raise the question of G20, the balance of power within the WTO has considerably changed from what it was earlier. Now, to that extent, if countries like India, China, Indonesia, Brazil have really become extremely important in all global trade conversations, agreed they have vulnerable populations, agreed that they have weak communities, but does the special and differential treatment as a whole homogeneously tend to get to applied from them in the way it applies for Malawi, in the way it applies for Laos, in the way it applies for a large number of other countries? I'm not saying either yes or no, but I think time has come to devote considerable thoughts to this.
Well, I'll pose the last question to Marianne, since she's at Chatham House, and it's a nice place to be to think about this issue, which is that given the East-West conflict, do you think the geopolitical environment today is in fact conducive for United States, China, European Union, India, and South Africa, Brazil to actually sit together and try to solve problems in WTO and on the North-South issues? I mean, are these two kind of interacting in a way today where one is going to complicate the other?
I think we are in that situation where they mutually reinforce each other in a negative sense, as in complicating a very complex environment already. And I think, again, just looking at the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which would have been the ideal opportunity to actually coordinate and cooperate on some of those underlying long-standing trade challenges, that opportunity was missed. And I think it's also missed in the sense of it was a key issue for the WTO to actually step up. And again, 2 years on, we still really haven't made progress on some of those key issues, whether it's regarding intellectual property rights and a waiver on that front, or a larger agreement looking to the next pandemic potentially on a broader health and kind of initiative on that front. So I think the geopolitical environment is not favorable to actually move progress. And I think even as we've kind of identified that the future is probably going to be in the plurilateral space, let's not kid ourselves. It's not going to be a cure-all for all of the troubles either, because even those plurilateral negotiations still require compromise. They still are going to be held back by disagreement over flexibilities, which regarding our developing countries, for example. So I think there is a workaround, but really it comes down to the WTO members to take the next step, and it's easy to kind of hide behind the organization. I think there has to be a lot more in that space to actually get to a place, an easier path for integrating some of those plurilateral agreements into the multilateral framework. I think that's the only way forward.
Excellent. And that brings us almost to the end of our time. And I think that's a very sobering note to end the conversation on. I agree with your assessment. Biswajit referred to GATT. If you go and look at the history of the creation of GATT, the United States, having come out as the victor of the Second World War, took a magnanimous view of the post-war global situation and was willing to create a framework for trade which was open, which was inclusive, and which gave space, not just to countries that had been defeated in the war, but to the newly liberated, decolonizing economies of India and other African countries. So in a sense, the GATT system took off because there was a positive and a favorable global geopolitical leadership at a very interesting geopolitical moment, which is after the war. And I think as the COVID crisis has shown us, there is simply no such leadership available. I mean, here you had a pandemic and the world is still running short of supply of vaccines, and yet we have seen nothing but vaccine nationalism. We have seen restrictions on the global trade and movement of vaccines, and there's no international leadership. And I think plurilateralism has emerged as a default option, not because it's a superior option, but simply because multilateralism does not have leadership. I think which is the kind of note I would end this conversation on and hand this discussion back to our host, Mishra, thanking ICRIER and KAS for giving us this opportunity, a fascinating conversation, and 4 very distinguished panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sanjay, for steering today's discussion and making this webinar very lively. This was truly a very engaging and enlightening session. And like Peter very rightly said, it's a treat to have heard everyone today at the webinar. I would like to thank CAS for collaborating with ICRIER on this very important subject on which the discourse is limited. It requires a lot more discussion, but unfortunately, we need to revive the discussion. And we are very happy that on an important theme like this, we are bringing experts together. Thanks to all the panelists who joined us from different parts of the world, from different time zones. Thank you for your time, including your time at the pre-webinar session where you very kindly agreed to talk to us and chalk out how we could make the webinar interesting. And of course, a big thank you to all the participants for showing your interest and for asking very relevant questions. We truly value that. And lastly, I would like to add that I really enjoyed curating this webinar series. Our next webinar is on WTO 2.0, in which we would be discussing new issues that are posing a challenge to the WTO and how these can be addressed. And we look forward to being with all of you again in that session. With this,